Well, good to see you this morning. Obviously, we've got some competition with one of our sunny days. That's a tough one to beat, isn't it? A sunny day on a weekend. Where would I rather be, the beach or church? I know the answer is Jesus, but I'm going to say the beach. Anyway, good morning, welcome. Welcome online, but not welcome if you're at the beach. Okay. It's actually not supposed to be me today. I had something else planned, but it fell through at the last minute. So I apologise that this is the fifth week in a row that you've got to put up with me. But anyway, you'll get a reprieve soon, I promise, okay? Anyway, if you have your Bibles there, open them up to John chapter 20, verse 24 to 29. That's the passage we're going to be looking at this morning. And the message I want to talk about this morning is, can we just put the title slide up, please, guys? Yeah, it's okay to need to see. And this is a message for anyone here this morning who's ever had a time in their life, or maybe going through a time in their life right now, where you're struggling to believe, where you're struggling to have faith for something. And also, not just struggling to believe and struggling with some faith, but struggling with what almost invariably follows that sense of guilt and shame that we can get with that, because aren't we just supposed to be able to believe stuff? Isn't that what faith is all about? Who knows what I'm talking about there? Yeah. Well, if you don't, you're welcome to go for an early coffee, because this doesn't apply to you. But for us lesser mortals, we'll be talking about that. And what I want you to hear this morning is this. Sometimes it's just not that easy to believe. And sometimes it's okay to need to see. And I want to look at a pretty well-known story where one of the disciples, Thomas, doubts that Jesus has been resurrected and says, unless I see his hands and his feet, and unless I put my hand in his side, I'm not going to believe it. But I don't want to focus on the doubt, which is something we often do. I don't want to focus on his doubt, and I don't want to focus on our doubt, because I don't think that's where the weight of the story lands or should land. Where I think the weight of the story should land is on the transformative, graceful response of Jesus, because that's where the power is. It's not about our doubt, right? Any more than we focus on our sin. Our sin only ever amplifies or magnifies the grace of God, right? And it's the same with our doubt. It's okay to have doubt, but doubt is not the issue. We don't want to get hung up on talking about doubt, and as trendy as that is sometimes. It's about the transformative, gracious response of Jesus and where that lands. So I'm going to read the story from John chapter 20. Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, which simply means twin, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came the first time. So the other disciples said to him, "We've seen the Lord." But he said, "Look, unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands? Reach out and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." And Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed." Now, because of this one episode that's recorded in the Bible, and I imagine Thomas is in eternity now saying to John, "Thanks, John. Thanks for recording that," okay? Thomas has been known for the last 2,000 years as Doubting Thomas, right? And it's become a moniker that's used pejoratively for people today. If you are cynical, if you are skeptical, if you don't believe something, people will more likely than not call you a Doubting Thomas. But I think that's really unfair to Thomas. Why? For two reasons. Well, the first is that it is only a moment in time. It's a snapshot, right? It's not Thomas's entire life. How would you feel if your life was defined by one of your less than best moments? I have told this story before, so bear with me if you've heard it, because it makes the point. You know, I was in the army, and I was an army musician, right? And one of the things that army musicians do is we do lots of parades and lots of bands. So we do concerts and all that sort of stuff, but our main bread and butter was, parades and marches and stuff like that. And I was a French horn player. And we didn't always use French horns on the march. Sometimes we did, sometimes we didn't. And the times where we didn't use French horns on the march, I was on side drum, right? And the thing with the army side drums is you don't just play the side drums, you're doing things with your sticks as well, right? You're doing all this fancy stuff with your sticks. And it looks pretty cool. It looks pretty cool. If you get it right. I mean, that's a big if sometimes. Anyway, so we do all of that. And we were wearing our winter ceremonials, which is like this red thing. And some genius had the idea, you know, it would look really flash with you guys doing all this stuff with your sticks if you wore white gloves as well. And so they gave us white, 100% nylon gloves to hold a polished wood stick. So we were doing this really big, called the freedom of the city that was being given. So a city will give the keys of the city to the regiment that's there, and you know, streets are lined with thousands of people, and we kick off and we're marching down the street and we're doing all our stuff, and then damn, there goes stick number one, right? So I'm just, you know, playing along with the second one, and then there goes stick number two, right? So I'm like the Marcel Marceau of drumming, and I probably thought, why's that guy like dancing? But what made it worse was it was at that point that a press photographer took a photo. Now, that's fine, except that photo ended up on our wall. So there's all these drummers with sticks, and then there's Stick Chucker Jackson in the middle, just waving his gloved hands around. Right? Now the point is, I've done hundreds of marches and never done that. The one time I do it, it gets memorialised on the wall. As far as I know, that photo is still there to this day. And so if I was to ever go to a reunion, people would go, that's you. You're the guy. Now, none of us are any one moment in time, are we? None of us are any one moment in time. It might be a moment, it might be a phase, it might be a season, but it does not typify or exemplify our entire life, okay? So if anyone is here defining themselves by their worst day, or being defined by it, you've got to stop that, okay? For whatever it is about this moment for Thomas, and I'm going to argue, ultimately it really wasn't a big deal. It was not all there was to Thomas. He had signed up to follow Jesus, don't forget that. He had signed up to follow Jesus. He had left everything behind to follow Jesus. That took faith and that took guts. He was among the 12 that had been sent out 2 by 2 to go and proclaim the kingdom and heal the sick and cast out demons and bring people into the kingdom. He went and he did that, right? He did that. And tradition tells us that he never gave up, because apparently he went as far as India, where he died a martyr. And yet there is still a movement of Christianity today in India that traces its ascendancy to Thomas himself. All right? So, we are all so much more than one moment or one episode in our life, and so was Thomas. All right? The other thing in this, he was not the only one who needed to see. He was not the only one who needed proof. And this is something we don't often see when we read through these verses. Let's pick up the first verse, can we, guys, from John chapter 20, verse 19. This is a little bit just before the Thomas episode. And it says, on the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them. Peace be with you. After this, he showed them, this is the other 11 disciples, he showed them his hands and his side. And they were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. Can you put up the next one, please, from Luke 24? While they were still talking about this is Luke's version of events, right? While they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, peace be with you. They were startled and frightened, and listen to this, thinking they saw a ghost. So what's their immediate response? Not, oh, sweet, Jesus is back. No, it's a ghost. And this is the second time they've thought Jesus is a ghost, right? He said to them, why are you troubled? And why do doubts arise in your minds? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have. When he said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. And while they still did not believe it, did you get that? While they still did not believe it, because of joy and amazement, he asked them, do you have anything to eat? Now, chronologically, there's about a week between the 11 disciples seeing Jesus and Thomas seeing Jesus. But they've got no reason to be smug about it this second time. They've got no basis for doing a bit of side-eye towards Thomas when he says, I'm not going to believe it unless I see Jesus' hands and feet. Because they went through exactly the same thing. They had no right to be sitting there going, oh, Thomas, come on, man, where's your faith? Why don't you just believe that it's Jesus? You know, it's in the Bible. You should know that Jesus was going to come back from the dead. How come you don't believe? We believed. And Jesus is like, yeah, right, you believed. I was there. I remember exactly what happened. No, they had no reason to be stuck. They thought he was a ghost, and he had to show them his hands and his feet and his side. And Luke's very intentional about using that language, and so is John, because guess what? That's exactly what Thomas was asking for. In effect, Thomas was only asking for what everyone else had already had, right? So let's just be fair on Thomas, okay? He's not a moment in time, and he's no different to anyone else, especially these 11 guys, where he just needed to see what they had seen to give him something to stand on to help him get across the line there. Sometimes we get so hung up on the doubt part of it that we don't take enough time to notice that Jesus happily gave Thomas what he was asking for. There was no pushback, there was no pregnant pause, there was no awkwardness. He just said, here you go. Check it out for yourself and see. And furthermore, there was no rebuke and there was no condemnation. Sometimes we need to see. And sometimes we need to touch to be able to believe. Sometimes we need something a little more tangible. Sometimes we need something a little more tactile. And God is okay with that. God is completely okay with that. Psalm 34 verse 8 says, taste and see that the Lord is good. They are tactile words that speak about our need to experience something in order to believe it. And it is an invitation that God gives us to come and try it. Come and see that what I've got to say is true. Jesus says the same thing in John 7:17. He says, whoever chooses to do his will shall know whether my teaching is from God or whether I speak on my own. That word know means to know through experience. It's not about mental assent or cognitive assent. It's about knowing through experience. And what Jesus is actually saying this. If you want to know I am who I say I am and that my teaching comes from God, here's how we do it. You don't just have to accept it at face value. Try it out. Try it out. Live out the values. Live out the teaching that I'm giving you. And find out for yourself through experience that it is true. Jesus is effectively saying, try before you buy. I'm not afraid that this is going to fall over and not work. I'm confident that what I say is true. You try it and then tell me what you think, because you will experience what I'm promising. Jesus meets us where we're at. He is not put off by our wobbles, by our doubts, by our inability to simply just believe on the spot. He is not put off by that, and he is happy to meet us where we are at, especially when we come wanting something to be true, which we'll look at in a minute. We have to stop seeing doubt as a failure in some way, or worse, a sin. That's a dangerous thing, and it's damaging in all sorts of ways. I mean, seriously, if the choice we have is only ever between simply believing something or not believing something, where can we go? Because in life and through stuff we experience, we are going to bump up against stuff, we are going to hear stuff that is simply not that easy for us to go, I believe 100% that thing. And if we can't believe that, and the only other option is then I must disbelieve, then what's going to happen to us? We're going to think, well, I disbelieve, and then that's going to start taking us down some path we don't really want to be on. But if there's a third option of unbelief, that gives us something to work with, doesn't it? We can work with unbelief, because doubt is not disbelief. Doubt comes from a word that simply means two. To believe means to be in one mind about something, I believe it. To disbelieve means to be in one mind about something, I don't believe it. To doubt means I'm not quite sure where I land between these two at the moment. And there's hope in that, isn't there? There is hope that we can move from this, I'm not so sure I believe, to, oh, okay, I'm actually starting to see that and I believe that now. But if our only other option is you either believe or you don't, well then I'm just going to have to say I don't, because I don't. and there's nowhere to go with that. And why this sticks in my craw so much is because there is this monochromatic, binary Christian world that some people portray where everything is black and white. And ironically, the team are all in black and white today as some sort of metaphor, okay? Living metaphor, and contradicting what I was about to say this morning, all right? Which is why I've worn a colourful white shirt, because I don't live in their monochromatic world, okay? Everything is black and white, and you're either in or you're out. You either believe or you don't believe. They think that's the world it is, rather than the spectrum that it actually is. And I was doing some research for this whole thing, and I came across a couple of commentaries and blogs that just made me really angry, because almost to a person, they all managed to say the same thing, that Jesus rebukes Thomas for his lack of belief. Jesus rebukes Thomas for his sin. One guy even went so far as to say the reason Jesus left it a week was so Thomas could stew in his doubt. And I just thought, yeah, sign me up to your Jesus, mate, because he sounds wonderful. No, where do we get this view of a vindictive, mean Jesus, right? Who has zero empathy or sympathy for us and how we function and how we work, and says, well, if you don't just believe it the first time, I'm going to make you suffer until you do. You know what I mean? It just doesn't add up with the God that I know and the one I see presented in the person of Jesus. All right? It just doesn't. The Jesus I see is compassionate and kind all the time and forbearing. Okay? Not someone who says, stew in your doubt, sucks to be you, suffer in your jocks. You know what I mean? Like, that is not the Jesus I know. So the other thing I want to say about that is, one, Jesus never rebukes Thomas. Never. He never rebukes him in this. It's not there. And Jesus never calls it sin. He does say, look, it's better if you can believe without seeing. You're more blessed if you can believe without seeing. But he never says it is wrong or sinful to need to see. And that's really important. And it is better. It is more blessed. To be able to believe without needing some sort of sign or proof, Jesus actually says it. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed. More blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed. Jesus said it. I'm not going to argue with that. It is actually better. In Matthew 8, there's a story of a Roman centurion, and he comes to Jesus and he says, my servant is sick and he's about to die. And Jesus says, well, take me to him. And the centurion says, you don't need to come to my place. I know how authority works. You can just say the word here and he'll be fine. And Jesus says, even in all of Israel, even amongst my people, the people who are supposed to be the people of faith, I have never found such faith. I've never seen such faith. Your servant has been healed, right? But then we have another story in Mark 9 where a father comes to Jesus and he says, my child is sick. Jesus, if there is anything you can do, could you do it? And Jesus says, if there's anything I can do, anything is possible for those who believe. And the father says, look, I do believe, but you're going to have to help me overcome my unbelief. Which is a kind of weird statement, but it's kind of where some of us sit sometimes. Like, I believe, I do, but I'm not quite there. And I'm going to need you to help me move past that to the point where I just believe. But here's what I want us to understand about that. Jesus says it's more blessed to believe when you haven't seen. But the thing is, both types of faith get rewarded. Jesus answers both requests. The one who comes with unmitigated, unequivocal belief, I believe you can do it, just say the word and it's done. And the guy who comes stumbling along and says, I kind of believe it, but I'm not quite there yet. Jesus answers that prayer too. We need to hear that, right? Yeah, it's better if we can just believe, but Jesus will meet us where we're at. Now, the other thing about that is it's not like we're one or the other of those completely all the time. Sometimes we're both and, aren't we? Okay, sometimes we're both and. In some instances, we can be like that centurion. For some reason, we just have an ability to be able to go, I just believe that to be true. I just 100% believe that. I don't doubt that for 1 second. But at other times, we're more like the Father, where we go, and that can depend on a number of things. It could depend on what we're facing. It could depend on what we're going through. It could depend on some phase in life. Any number of things, okay? But we're never just the one thing. Sometimes we're there. We believe everything. You know, there are things that I believe without reservation. There are things that I believe without reservation. And in fact, even when I went through my phase where I decided I didn't want to be a Christian anymore, and I didn't want to go to church, and I'd given up the whole thing, the one thing that never changed for me, and actually was the thing that spoiled everything for me, was I 100% believed in the resurrection of Jesus. And I thought, well, if that's true, then all this other stuff's got something to it as well. Damn. And I had to come back to being a Christian again, right? But that's something, to this day, I still 100% believe in. I can't get proof of that, but I believe it. But there are other times where I'm really like the Father and I believe I just need help with my unbelief. That's where I'm at now with this thing that I'm going through. You know, I would love to believe everything's going to be okay. I just can't believe that. That's why, as I said a few weeks ago, I'm really counting on you guys to believe for me for the things I can't believe for myself. And in your praying for me to be doing that. And I really appreciate that people are doing that. Sometimes we just need something a little more tangible and tactile and substantial to hang our hat on. Sometimes we just need to say to Jesus, I believe. You're going to have to help me with my unbelief because I actually need to see something. I actually need some evidence. I need some proof. I need some sort of sign that you are onto this. That's all. The other thing is we can grow in this. The more we see and the more we experience, the more we see God come through, the greater our faith is going to become. That's why having the freedom to work through this stuff without guilt, without shame, without a feeling of inferiority is so important because it can help us come to a point of legitimate belief rather than either outright rejecting it because we can't accept it straight away or worse, faking it. It can bring us to a point where we've worked through enough stuff where we can go, now I actually do believe. Because faith is something that often builds up over time. That's why the Israelites always had a practice of memorializing things so they could always look backwards when they had to go forwards based on what God had done. It was their way of going, how can I have faith for this thing that is about to come? I look back at some of the things that God has done, and that in turn fills me with belief that if he's done that, he can do this, right? Our faith builds over time. It's okay for our faith to grow. The other thing is there's more than one type of doubt. Yes, there is this negative, cynical, skeptical, I don't believe it, never in a million years, it's not possible, there's some other agenda, another explanation for this type of doubt. And let's face it, there's a whole cottage industry sprung up around this in Christian circles, right? You know, where doubt's just a really cool thing to have and people sit around picking it apart for ages. And it's skeptical, right? It's skeptical. They're not really looking for answers, they just want to dissect everything. And it doesn't bear good fruit. But there's also this thing called hopeful disbelief, right? Hopeful disbelief, where you want something to be true, but can't quite there yet. Where you want something to be true, but it just seems too good to be true. In fact, that's what the disciples went through in Luke 24:41. It says, while they still did not believe it, why? Because of their joy and amazement. They were like, I can't believe that it's Jesus. Not, oh, I can't believe that's Jesus. This can't ever happen. Wasn't that sort of skeptical, cynical stuff. Because they were overjoyed, it was too good to be true. And it took a while for their faith to catch up to that. There's no switch we can flick to turn our faith on. Sometimes we just need time to process things, to work through it and to wrestle with it. And that can take time. And that's okay. Because even this story was not the end of the story. Weeks later, when the disciples had gone to the place where Jesus had told them to go, a mountain, where he was about to ascend back into heaven, and he gives them the Great Commission. He's about to leave and give them the Great Commission, and they're about to go out. You know what it says in verse 28, Matthew 28:17? They worshipped him, but some doubted. Like, didn't we settle that in the room? This is now weeks later. You know, have you ever had those experiences where you're like, oh yeah, I've got it now, I believe. And then you go away and go, not so sure. Did we collectively imagine that? Like, what's going on? Worship, but they still doubted. But you know what? They got there. They got there. How do I know they got there? Well, Thomas was like, my Lord and my God, right? That's all the proof that he needed. And to be honest, I think out of the people that doubted that day, he was not one of them, because in the moment he had the integrity to go, I need some proof up front, right? And he got his proof, so he'd settled the matter. But I know the others got there. You know why I know the others got there? Because every single one of them went on to do what Jesus had called them to do and to die for it. And you don't go and do that unless you believe in the thing that you're selling, right? So there's no value in going out pushing a story that you haven't bought into yourself. They believed and they were willing to give their life for it. It's important we understand that coming to a place of belief, of certainty about things, or faith. Sometimes I think faith and certainty are mutually exclusive. But anyway, that's a whole other... I'll do that another day, okay? Because faith is faith, right? It's not about certainty, it's faith. Otherwise, if there's certainty, you don't need faith. That's it in a nutshell. Anyway, I'll make that last 45 minutes and just confuse you all. It's important that we understand that we have the time and the opportunity and the environment to work through stuff and to grow in our faith and to come to a place of belief, whether it's about a doctrinal thing or whether it's about an answer to prayer or anything like that. I saw this quote recently, and it was about young people, but to be honest, I think it's applicable to all people at the moment because of the increasingly complex world that we live in. But it was basically, people aren't looking for a place to give them all the answers, they're just looking for somewhere safe to be able to ask the questions. And I think that has to be particularly true of the church, particularly today, where people can come along and it's not you're either in or you're out or you believe or you don't. It's like, no, it's okay to be here and to wrestle with that stuff. It's okay to be working through that stuff and working out what you genuinely believe about all of this. This is the place for that. So we've got to lose any image of God as someone who demands that somehow we just believe, and who has no sympathy or empathy for us. You know, the Bible says he knows that we are but dust, right? He knows that we're human. He knows how frail and how all our foibles and that. So we've got to remember that God is a compassionate God, okay? And he understands that we don't just get it like that. We've got to lose any image of God that's constantly disappointed in us for not measuring up immediately as well. And we've got to lose any image of God that doesn't align with Jesus. In Isaiah 42:1, Isaiah prophesied this, and it was about the ministry of Jesus. It says, a bruised reed he will not break, and a smouldering wick he will not snuff out. And Matthew quotes that when he looks at the ministry of Jesus, and he quotes that verse. Why? Because that was what he saw in the ministry of Jesus. Someone who didn't respond cruelly or harshly or coldly to people's genuine doubts and fears and questions, but rather someone who took whatever was there, whether it was a broken reed or a candle that was about to go out, and he would breathe life into that rather than snuff it out through his callousness. That's why I say the weight of this story lands on the gracious, transformative response of Jesus and not on Thomas's doubt. Because this story could have spun off in a completely different direction. If Jesus had rebuked Thomas, if Jesus had, put him down and said, I can't believe that you don't believe, who knows where that could have gone for Thomas? But he didn't. He met him with grace, and Thomas's life took a completely different trajectory. And that's where the weight of the story falls. So Thomas went on to do what he was called to do because Jesus met him graciously at that point. So surely, this is what I want us to understand, God is in the business of helping us move to a place of disbelief. Move to a place of belief. Or disbelief. God is in the business of helping us move to a place of belief, right? Rather than killing whatever little faith or hope or whatever it happens to be that we do have. He wants to breathe on the embers of that and bring it to life, not snuff it out through being condemning and harsh and cold. So I want to encourage you guys, wherever you're at, it's okay. It's okay to need to see. It's okay to need something tangible and tactile. It's okay to be wrestling and struggling. Jesus is more than big enough to handle that. And he will only ever respond graciously to you in that place because he wants to see your faith grow, not be extinguished. Amen?